We've recently made changes to the way risk scoring is calculated in Vantage. These changes should make it easier to understand, easier to configure, and easier to use across your business. Let's take a little look. So I'm here on the Nozomi Networks headquarters Vantage instance, and I'm looking here at a Meraki access point. And you can see it has an overall risk score of 10. And your first response is, so what does that mean? How is that calculated? With the changes we've made recently, if I hover over this information icon here, you can see what metrics feed into this total risk score and how it's put together. These risk scores are configurable through asset rules. And we can change the rules to be as broad, as generic, or as specific and focus in on single assets or asset types to suit your environment, whichever way you need it. I'll show you how in the lab. So now here in my Lab Vantage instance, I've selected up some assets here, which are all from Cisco. So we can go into any one of these assets and see that risk hasn't been computed yet. I've done a recent reset and we're starting from scratch here. And if I want to apply risk rules, all I need to do is drop down here and say create asset rule from this asset. Now I've already done this, we've already created this rule, so we'll just change over to the one I made earlier. This asset rule, I've made it specifically for these Cisco devices. And we've got some matching conditions here where we're saying if the type is a switch and the vendor is from Cisco and the technology category is OT, then this rule will apply. Let's have a little look at what other conditions there are. So we could add further conditions to either broaden or narrow the application of this rule based on label, MAC address, product name, OS firmware, site sensor zones. There's a lot of things in there, and you really can get quite specific or broad depending on what you need. Scrolling down the page a little, we see that if we meet these conditions, then we're going to take the action to configure the asset risk. And in the risk simulation here, we can see how the calculations put together. And there are basically these sliders. These sliders adjust the overall score. So looking at, say, asset criticality here, the purple part of the graph, if I mess with the slider, if I change the slider, I change the criticality of this device and how or what proportion criticality makes up of the calculation here. So I can have this quite high, and if I drop the compensating control down and say we have no compensating controls, we get a very high risk score. Alternatively, if we have very good compensating controls, I'd venture to say that this is near impossible in the real world, have a really high compensating control. Actually, maybe the compensating control for this is it's not plugged in and it's on a shelf in a locked cupboard. Then you could have zero risk, but otherwise I don't think it's possible. Anyway, I digress. If we mess with this mitigation with the compensating control slider, you can see the risk value changes overall. So I know that this particular device is locked in a cabinet in my lab and it's only accessible via physical access here on site. So I'm okay saying that my compensating control is quite high, even though my criticality is also quite high. And these are the figures which go in to adjust, or these are the inputs, the variables rather, which go in to adjust the output risk calculation that we get at the end. Further down, we're looking at additional components that go into the mix of this overall score. So we have a vulnerabilities risk, a communication risk, an alerts risk, and a device risk. And you can see I've made some custom settings there, particularly in communication and device risk, around this device based on what I know and what I'm comfortable with. Finally, we set a priority and we can give it a name, and then we would save our rule and it would be applied to the devices, the assets on our network, depending on how broad or how narrow the matching criteria at the start were. When you finish creating your asset rules, they're applied and the results propagate through Vantage. When that's complete, you're able to take a look at a new asset scoring, asset risk section within Vantage. So we drop down the menu and there, asset risk. In this display, you're able to see how your overall risk is trending over time and how you compare to other customers within your industry around the world. Across the top row are 5 boxes going left to right. The custom risk is your overall risk score based on the rules you've defined. The Nozomi risk is your overall risk score compared to customers within your industry. The remaining 3 boxes show the network zones within my environment with the highest risk scores or the biggest changes. Towards the center, we can see a risk trend, and we can enable or disable the Nozomi risk, and we can enable an advanced breakdown of the risk score. With the advanced breakdown enabled, you can see in this box how the score is made up. At the very bottom, we see benchmarking. On the left-hand side, cybersecurity risk. That's the risk within my industry, which is cybersecurity. On the right is saying this is what similar customers within that industry are experiencing. So one is the overall industry, one is similar customers. If we go into the details tab, in this screen, we see the zones, the sites, and the sensors carrying the most risk, both in a numeric breakdown and in trends. In the benchmark screen, on this screen, we see our cybersecurity risk presented as a bar graph against other customers and as a trend line over time against customers within our industry around the world.